So, Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, thanks very much for finally joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
We are going to be discussing sort of I would now say sort of infamous book, Noumenautics, with the subtitle Metaphysics, Meta-Ethics, Psychedelics, it really revolves around the thinking of three thinkers, though not implicitly. It's a collection of essays, but they all draw on Whitehead, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche in a certain sense. And there's also elements of psychonautics, which is coming from Junger, and the psychedelic overlap of philosophy, which is critically ignored, which we'll get to, and many other interesting things which would struggle to find their way into the academy today, I would argue. But there you go. So it's a very interesting book. So I'm very, happy to have you here. I would normally ask people to introduce themselves, but you're pretty well known to the fringe philosophy crowd.
Am I? I don't know.
I think so. I think so. So I'll just open up with the Hermitix question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room, listening on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Well, I suppose it would have to be the three thinkers that I'm not the ones you said, but the ones I've sort of moved on to recently in my new book. It would probably be Spinoza, Whitehead, and I don't know if it would be Nietzsche or William James, if I kind of a fourth. But I it would be nice for them to sort of debate discrepancies between their thoughts. For example, with Spinoza and Whitehead says that he sees his own work in a way as a sort of continuation of Spinoza plus theory of evolution, really. Sort of Darwin plus Spinoza equals Whitehead, you could say, to be really basic. But there's an interesting difference between them, which is that Spinoza believes that the laws of nature are absolutely static. They have to be, because the concept of God is perfect. It's like an ontological argument for God, and thus God is nature, and thus the laws of nature are part of that. They cannot change, and thus he's a fatalist. That's why he's stoical in the sense that one should accept fate and so on. Whereas Whitehead argues that the laws of nature are reflections, mere after reflections, really, of the operations of matter, and matter itself, or rather matter energy, is organism for him. It's the philosophy of organism, Whitehead calls his work. So that as all organisms evolve, including matter itself, thus do the laws of nature evolve as reflections of that underlying matter. And so there are no static laws at all. These are just regular, as Hume said, maybe the laws of nature are just regularities that we generalize from particular observations within the space of even hundreds of years, right? So that would be an interesting thing for Whitehead and Spinoza to iron out. It would probably take a few sessions at least. And then I suppose with William James, my latest essay, which is in the new book coming out in a few months, called Philosophy and Psychedelics with Bloomsbury. It's an edited volume, but my chapter in it is on Spinoza and the intellectual love of God in relation to psychedelic experience, especially 5-MeO-DMT experience, which is a very potent psychedelic. And I'm interested in looking at this so-called third kind of knowledge that Spinoza talks about, the intellectual love of God, which is an intuition rather than a rationalization or experience of God itself or nature itself. And I just wondered, there's a lot of Spinoza scholarship on whether this was an important aspect of his philosophy, whether it was the most important or whether the least important. You get the full range in the scholarship. And as James sort of explored these questions philosophically, he was sort of one of the pioneers of psychedelic philosophy, really interesting for him to get his nose into that. And then I'd have Nietzsche just to stir things up, talking about sort of Christian assumptions in all of their work, especially Whitehead. Russell said of Whitehead, there's something of the vicarage around him, even though he Whitehead sort of rejected his Anglican upbringing in life in the late 1800s. Still, there was probably this Christian assumption therein, as he also says of Schopenhauer. So I think anyway that would be an interesting party.
Okay. I mean, we were speaking before about how we'd both studied continental philosophy, and these modern thinkers, we sort of they're no longer dealing with like a big problem. They're not, not in the sense that Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche are in a certain sense. I mean, it seems perhaps now thinking back, reading your book, there's a clear philosophical problem for you which you're trying to get to the bottom of. Do these thinkers align for you for a certain problem which you've been struggling with throughout your work, or perhaps not struggling with, but trying to figure out?
Well, I think one of the ultimate sort of questions for me is what is the extent of the mind in nature, very broadly speaking. And, and thus my PhD was on panpsychism, which is the view that mind floods nature. It's in all things, essentially, of different varieties. I know you've had a podcast about this already, so I won't get into it too much, but there's that. And, what questions concerning, what are the units of subjectivity? This is a really difficult question. The holons, as Arthur Koestler calls them, or the monads, as Leibniz Bruno calls them, and so on. How do you what's the criterion for differentiating that? And how does all of that reflate to value? In terms of aesthetics and ethics. I think, like Whitehead says, experience is intrinsically valuation, so you can't really differentiate them concretely. I suppose that's the overarching question, and then sort of late. I mean, panpsychism is always, going downwards, into sort of, the mammals to the insects to the molecules and so on. Of course, there's an upward strand as well, which is known as, in modern parlance, cosmopsychism, but in old parlance is known as pantheism. It's essentially the same thing, really, if you look at the details, because there's different varieties of each, which is, is there sort of an overmind. And this relates to psychedelic philosophy, of course, because, Aldous Huxley speaks about mind at large in his Doors of Perception in the 50s. And then looking at Spinoza, especially in the last couple of years, he's got this notion of, nature is God. Does that mean there's no God at all? Or, well, a lot of people think that, such as Ernst Haeckel, I've just recently realized. But he does, Spinoza does talk about the infinite intellect. So there's infinite space and there's infinite mind. And so that's his God. So it's not merely sort of a material God, it's something a bit more than that, even though it's not a God. It's not a loving God. He said, Spinoza explicitly says, God does not love you. So anyway, so that's another aspect of mind and nature, like where do you stop and that's related to teleology and values and so on. Okay. This is very broad, I realize. Very broad. That's the outskirts of it all.
Okay. But I think, to draw another clear aspect of your work in, when I did another interview a while ago now on DMT, and someone who'd written a book on the philosophy of DMT and what that brings, he basically said, when you're drawn in to this world, I'm not a psychedelic user, or, I've just quit caffeine, so that says enough about me. But he says, the world is teeming with intelligence and life. That was his experiences of DMT that he came from. So do you see psychedelics as basically a very practical means to empirically, in a way, bridge the gap of unknowing between a theoretical panpsychism saying, right, well, take this, here's proof of panpsychism?
To a certain extent, yes. Although it's very, very difficult. So yes, I do. I mean, ultimately, you get an intuition, or you get a sort of a sensed intuition, at least, of the theory behind, for example, panpsychism, I think. So, the recent empirical studies on psychedelics inducing nature connectedness, more of an sympathy to natural objects, plants, whatnot. And these studies have the main goal of trying to push the idea that psychedelics are good for your mental health. So nature connection is good for mental health research. But my question there is like, well, why would it, if that's the case, and a lot of these studies are a bit dodgy, really. But if that's the case, if it is, why would psychedelics allow for this nature connectedness? Now, like from a certain ontological perspective, let's take the typical sort of mechanist perspective that's a legacy of Descartes, Galileo, and so on, Newton in the West now. that nature connectedness would have to be in a hallucination, and thus, although it's a kind of comforting delusion, as it's known, and then there are philosophical questions as to whether, so what, should we give people these comforting delusions, or is it unethical, right? This is like a question in Michael Pollan posed, and Chris Leatherby and others, but that's it's only a delusion, such in this case a delusion, if you take this ontological perspective. Like years of study of this perspective shows me that there are so many logical problems associated with it. Like, for example, problems of emergence, problems of mental causation, hard problem consciousness, blah, blah, blah. And then through my study of Whitehead and his notion of abstractions, fallacies of misplaced concreteness, and so on, location, simple location, you realize that, okay, well, this actually, the judgment that such a psychedelic experience is a delusion rests upon an ontology which you can see stems from a very Western perspective that is very questionable. So when you do question that, suddenly the sort of intuition of, in this case, nature connectedness, doesn't necessarily have to be a delusion. So, the way I generally frame it, which is, I suppose, quite somewhat common, is, I see Descartes, as always, has been sort of the arch demon, as it were, himself, in bifurcating nature into mind and matter, substance dualism. Spinoza was the antidote to that, with his monism, like mind and matter, or thought and extension were basically two expressions of the same thing, just like a triangle and square, both expressions of pyramid, right? Essentially different perspectives on the same thing, which he calls substance, but he also calls it nature, and he also calls it God, and that's what got into trouble. But if you take that point of view, you immediately realize, you really accept then that all matter has an intrinsic element of mind. That's the parallelism of panpsychism in it. And if that's the case, then such intuitions of connectedness to another other intrinsic values, intrinsic sentiences out there, doesn't have to be a delusion. It could be something veridical, objectively real. And I think a lot, Spinozism has got a lot going for it. The reason it wasn't really taken up in the West is because of the Christian power structures that suppressed it, and Judeo-Christian. For those of you who don't know, Spinoza was first of all excommunicated by his fellow Jews in the sort of mid 1600s, and then he died in 1677, and then his books were suppressed by the church, banned by the church for 100 years, and until we get in the sort of late 1700s, the pantheism controversy, which made his thoughts kind of brought it into the mainstream in Germany, at least, via people like Goethe, especially. And but it was too late. The sort of industrial revolution had gone with Descartes' notion of nature as completely mechanical, geometric, without any intrinsic value. And thus you get this, people think that panpsychism now is completely nuts because, well, that's because of, the historical trajectory. And thus, when you look at now, interestingly, when scientists who are sort of unwittingly caught up in this ontological legacy, which is, has all these problems, when they look at, interestingly, psychedelic experiences, they can't accept that there's any truth to them ultimately in these respects, and so you get these kind of sort of false ethical dilemmas about comforting delusions and so on. So coming back to your question, there, you can see like a kind of parallelism between mind and matter and Spinoza, Schopenhauer, people like this, Leibniz even, but it's all theoretical. It's possible that under the certain psychedelic experiences, you might feel that rather than just think it.
Philosophically speaking, then, I'll ask we could call it the hard question of representation, as we're both such a big fan of Schopenhauer. In a psychedelic experience where you're opened to this new reality, new experience, one could say, do you see us as, once again, within the same realm of representation, beyond representation, or in perhaps a new form of representation?
Well, this is where I like to go down this rabbit hole of Whitehead. I'm going to I have to bring up now. So one of the reasons I moved in a way, I've got much. As I mentioned, I was a Schopenhauer, still am in many respects. But his work's called The World's Will and Representation, Verstellen, presentation. And as a result, he's a realist. Whitehead called his book Process and Reality to contrast it with the idealist Bradley's Appearance and Reality. Mm. And the reason is that Whitehead doesn't see this dichotomy between appearance and reality. He's a realist rather than an idealist. And by that, and this is how I interpret nature connectedness to a certain extent. So by that, he means that the mind doesn't represent the external world as a kind of photograph or something, as a presentation. Rather, the outside world, or parts of the outside world, move into one's own subject, and the sort of a perception of that is both part of the subject and part of the object. So there's a fusion between the object and subject, if you can use those terms, in Whitehead's realism. That's why he also calls his philosophy organic realism. So organic because everything's an organism, essentially. There's no differentiation between the organic and inorganic. It's a full dichotomy. And he's a realist because, as I said, you get perception, causation and perception are essentially the same thing, right? And this is his solution to Hume's problem, causation as well. That you never see causation, you just see things collated all the time, constantly conjoined. But for Whitehead, all the perception. So when you see the sun, that seeing the sun is part of the sun itself, it's part of you, and there's this vectorization involved. So with psychedelic experience, my theory is that this vectorization, this fusion, is made more apparent to the subject. So a lot of psychonauts talk about feeling that they're at one with the tree or something like this, and this can go terribly new age, whatever. But there might be some element of truth in it when you realize that in our prosaic consciousness we sort of we like to externalize things so that we can act upon them. This is Bergson's philosophy, really, that Whitehead sort of adopted to a certain extent. But there's a form of perception, the mode of causal efficacy, Whitehead calls it, whereby that fusion happens always, but perhaps in the psychedelic experience, that form of perception, prehension, is made more conscious to the subject. In other words, one becomes more self-conscious of this primitive form of perception. Perhaps, this is a speculative philosophy, but it would make sense more of interconnection. It's what Bergson calls sympathy.
And that would allow it to alter space and time as well? Or is that a different thing altogether?
Well, I suppose to a certain extent, time is, our perception of time seems to be subjective. In other words, the species, the duration, the length of the duration of the present can be, contracted and extended by us, depending on our situation, and by the drugs we take. And presumably other organisms have not only different durations of the present, but also different rhythms of duration, as Bergson calls it. In other words, speeds of time. So the interesting philosophical question there is, well, what's that mean about objective time then? Has it got a certain objective speed? And so sometimes we see it veridically, really. Sometimes we hallucinate its speed. Or is there no objective speed, and it's our consciousness that creates it? And thus, when in relation to panpsychism, when you consider the different organisms of nature, then of course it seems that there's a myriad of different sort of speeds at which reality is being consciously perceived. And maybe again, psychedelics can allow one to, certainly it seems that way, famously time slows down, gets dilated, extends, I wrote in my book Noumenautics, Like when you see a sort of trail of your hand under psilocybin, for example, it could be that 5 seconds have been pushed into like a fraction of a second, something like this. And then ultimately, and this is what I've speculated in my latest essay called "The White Sun of Substance" on Spinoza and 5-MeO-DMT. Spinoza argues that ultimately God nature is timeless, it's eternal, outside of time. And it's thought that sort of puts it within time. And then he talks about this third kind of intuition, where you get a sort of intuition of the essence of reality, and which then would be timeless. So, again, it depends. You sort of interpreting psychedelic experience really depends on the metaphysical framework. So, but if we were to accept, as Minkowski and Einstein did, and Einstein, of course, was a Spinozist, that time ultimately is unreal, then certain experiences of timelessness, eternality, would again, plausibly be veridical. But these questions are not empirical questions. You can't prove it in any way, because of course observation means that we're using a prosaic experience, and questions of the mind generally can't be proved in any way at all. You just have to sort of see what's most parsimonious view, really, or what sort of leads to the fewest problems down the line.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask, because an overmind or God has been mentioned? Are you a spiritual or religious person? Do you have a framework there?
No, I'm not. No. I mean, I honestly, I approach this question in a purely secular way, right? This question of an overmind. I feel no consolation in it. I don't need it. Well, as far as I know myself, I don't need it in any way. But and I don't follow any religious path or anything like this. I mean, Whitehead said of Aristotle's God, Aristotle's got this notion of God as a prime mover. He's a complete narcissist. He's thinking about itself, right? Doesn't care about mankind or anything else. But nonetheless, it was this notion of a God. It's been translated as God, feels. Whitehead said Aristotle was the last thinker to conceptualize God in a non-religious way. Whitehead has also got, if that's not an oxymoron, right? Whitehead's also got a form of God, like a panentheism, which is certainly not linked to any religion. So I think you can, and then, like I said, this modern term cosmopsychism doesn't necessarily link up to any religion. That's probably why they're using instead of pantheism now, which has been sort of adopted, I suppose, to some extent. But I just, purely theoretically, could there be an overmind of some sort, an infinite intellect? I mean, Spinoza says, there's infinite space, and thus there's infinite mind as well, because they're parallels. If all of space is one aspect of mind, and by mind he doesn't mean consciousness, just basic sentience, some form or other, just like there are different forms of complexity of matter, then just as there's infinite space, so there has to be infinite mind. It doesn't actually speak much about what that means, interestingly, so just work on it.
So that would have been something that would be in relation to evolution for you, something that's perhaps evolved, but I guess if it's an infinite intelligence which has a different relationship to time, then you immediately run into a problem with evolution, right?
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, this is again coming back to this difference between Spinoza and Whitehead, really. So, from Spinoza's point of view, there's not his philosophy is not incompatible with evolution, not at all. But he doesn't mention it, doesn't know about it, of course, pre-Darwin, pre-Lamarck. Well, the infinite intellect wouldn't be affected by evolution for Spinoza, but for Whitehead, it is affected. Because in his philosophy, God there's a so-called consequent, I don't want to get into technicalities, but there's a consequent nature of God in Whitehead, whereby he experiences himself ultimately as part of nature, in terms of the evolution of the intensities of experiences in organisms. This is his fundamental goal in a way. So in other words, what happens with evolution is there's an upward trend, he calls it, which is not about survivability. It's rather about aesthetic experience. This is so aesthetics for Whitehead is primal. It's not a sort of derivative of evolution or something like this. It's a driver of evolution. It's so it's not survivability. Why? Because he says, for example, in the function of reason, rock has much more survivability value than a butterfly, for example. But nonetheless,
so it almost sounds like a secular chain of being.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, that's right, I guess.
So I'll ask you the annoying question, because I like conclusions to things. It must be a personal trait. What would be the teleology of this sort of form of not evolution, but Whiteheadian process?
Well, for Whitehead, there's never an end. So probably not a satisfying answer to you. But above God, the principle of the universe is creativity, and God is also subject to that. So, and there's just continual. I mean, it's process philosophy. There's just continual process, continual change, and there's never an end goal. There is a teleology there, certainly, in many respects. In other words, like I say, there's aesthetic intensity. Intensity of value as teloi within nature, and also, as it were, steering nature to a certain extent, just like our sexual instinct sort of steers the human survival and development of the human species. But there's never an end goal, In Bergson, there's a kind of end goal, which is to create, humans become gods, as he famously says in his last book. But for Whitehead, there's continual change, but that's radical. So, like, for example, the dimensions of space change, even, can change. They're just arbitrary. 3 dimensions of space is completely arbitrary for Whitehead. He was a great mathematician, physicist, who was one of the first at Cambridge to teach about non-Euclidean geometry with Grassmann and Gauss and people like that. So it's not mere speculation. Yeah, but there's no like a bit like Aristotle and Spinoza, I suppose. God doesn't have any moral imperative to which no heaven or hell to which we're heading. There's no, I mean, humanity is not like even important in Spinoza or Whitehead, relatively speaking. They're just part of nature. There's no, it's sort of gets rid of a anthropocentrism that we've had in Western thought.
I mean, I think this is what keeps me up at night when I think about Whitehead and this process philosophy, is how it's too open-ended. But so I mean, this does sort of eke into the other sections of the book and the other things that I wanted to touch on, because I think it was actually very a unique way of thinking about it, which is really nihilism. And of course, this is sort of almost, I guess, for anyone with a specific denominational or theistic following, or someone of a I am X, Y, or Z, this sort of thing is going to be, well, how do you not end up into some form of completely terminal relativism with regards to morals, meaning, and purpose? Or is that not do you not see that as a problem at all? Or, am I once again entering into anthropocentric thought by saying, like, oh, why if humans not going to have a purpose?
I mean, I see the nihilism that I endorse as an optimistic thing, positive thing, right? As it were, like, not positive in a moral sense, obviously, but it doesn't do me psychological harm. Quite the contrary, I find it quite emancipating. Well, I mean, for me, this really started with Nietzsche, and then I read the meta-ethicists of the 20th century, Stevenson, Mackie, people like that. And it's the notion, and then with Spinoza as well, and Whitehead, which I actually see as compatible with this, even though most Whiteheadians don't. But even morals are subject to process, to flow. They change. I say the laws of nature are subject to flow. Well, of course, the laws of morals also, or morality. But by which I mean normative morality, right? Prescriptive morality. So I don't know. Would you like me to sort of just explain what I mean by neonihilism, or would you like?
Well, I'm interested in that prescriptive morality. Actually, I mean, is that beholden to purely human culture? Is that like a culturally relative thing, or is that almost like a cosmic morality which is fluxing for you?
think that the basis of prescriptive morality, by which I mean when you like morals manifested in propositions that tell people to do that they ought to do something, should do something, was a duty to do something, as opposed to descriptive morality, which is that, you know, this culture believes this, that culture believes that. So this normative morality or prescriptive morality, you prescribe actions. I think there's a kind of you know, following Nietzsche really, and Schopenhauer, actually following Schopenhauer. Nietzsche stole it from Schopenhauer, I realized. You know, Schopenhauer even speaks of slave morals, right? But there's this so I don't know where to start with this really. So I think there's Schopenhauer. Let me start with him then. So he's you know, as you know, he's a follower of Kant in the sort of idealist sense, but he really completely rejected Kant's moral theory, deontology. Why? Well, one of the reasons was that he said, you know, Kant simply assumed. Kant asked the question, you know, what are the conditions for normative morality? And his answer was God, soul, and free will. And thus although that God, soul, and free will cannot be proved in Kant's idealist system, he says we have to presuppose them, otherwise normative morality is not possible. Right? That's very basically what he argued. Schopenhauer said, Schopenhauer argued, well, why are you presupposing that morality has to be prescriptive? You know, this is just you're just begging the question here. You know, it's sort of, and if you don't assume that, then you don't have to assume God, soul, and free will, which, you know, he rejects. And so the question is, yeah, well, why do you have to assume that morality must be normative? Where does that come from? Schopenhauer says it comes from the Decalogue, you know, the 10 Commandments in the Bible, really. You know, that thou shalt do this and do that. And this has sort of infested Western culture. He calls it slave morals. You know, Schopenhauer's got his own form of morality, which is more descriptive. You know, he says based on compassion, which is based on an intuition of the unity of things. But Nietzsche, you know, going one step forward, says even Schopenhauer's sort of valuation of compassion comes as Christian morality. Ultimately, you know, he accuses him of slave morality himself. You know, but coming back to prescriptive morality, you know, why do we assume that morality must take this imperative form? You know, telling people how they ought to behave, how they ought to think. Now, Spinoza's ethics, he also basically, you know, says the same thing in the 17th century. But he's got a virtue ethics where he says, listen, in order to attain tranquility of mind, one ought to do this, that, and the other, you know, sort of accept one's fate, for example, and so on, and not take people seriously because they have got no free will and so on. But all of that is a hypothetical imperative. You know, if you want to attain peace of mind, then one ought to do this. If one wants to lose weight, one ought not to eat so much. You know, these are called hypothetical imperatives, and oughts derived from ifs are fine, you know, logically fine. You know, but there's a distinction Kant makes between hypothetical imperatives as such and categorical imperatives, which are moral imperatives, which don't include an if clause. So, like, you know, one ought not to lie. You know, one ought to be altruistic. So on and so forth. There's the ultimate argument is that you can't have an ought without an if, you know. So these oughts are just sort of just assumed by Kant as part of his Christian heritage. He's Puritan, you know, in Prussia. Actually, you know, he's Lutheran, but what was his parents were? I can't remember now exactly, but anyway, some form of Lutheran, some form of Protestant. But this is just assumed. So where does that leave you? Well, it means that any judgment that says you ought to do this or that, or you ought not to do that, is just it's not based on any kind of fact, especially if you don't believe in God. Well, only if you don't believe in God. God is dead. This is Nietzsche's point. Therefore, all moral judgments, all normative moral propositions are not factual. They're just expressions. They're just commandments to change people's behavior. Now, where does that leave one exactly? It does leave one to a certain extent in an abyss. So when you look at a lot of political questions, if you believe this, then you realize that they don't have any definite answer, like arguing whether tea or coffee is better or not, which is superior, tea or coffee. There's no fact of the matter, as it were. However, this can be emancipating. So we often think old moral ideologies were immoral today, and you can be sort of emancipated from guilt and remorse through this, so it's kind of self-help in that sense, if you want that. And also, I came into panpsychism via Nietzsche with the will to power. Schopenhauer's will to survive, Spinoza's conatus. This is essentially like a basic drive within nature, which is not consciousness, but it's nonetheless not mere matter. It's something felt. It's a pathos, and that then bequeaths to nature value. So I'm in this strange position where I don't think there are objective values, but I do, unlike most, but at the same time, I do believe that there are far more values within nature than most people believe as well through the panpsychism. And once one realizes that, or once one believes that or accepts that, then that does change one's behavior and one's approach to nature. So there is deep ecology, founded by Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss. It's based on Spinozism mostly. It's this parallelism. It sort of gives nature both intrinsic value as opposed to instrumental value for us, and a sort of divinity as well. So you can still act according to values in this neonihilism, but you just have to realize that there's no absolute. There's no values change, fluctuate, and values are often contrary to other people's values, other organisms' values. The value of the survival of the human race, for example, might be antithetical to the values of other creatures on Earth. It'd be better for them if humans didn't exist, for example. But you can't say that the survival of human species is an absolute. Well, that's only, again, anthropocentrism. Objectively speaking.
So how does neonihilism not end up just basically reverting back to practical, normal, everything's meaningless, don't bother?
Well, so I suppose everything, although there's no objective value, no standard, no Platonic form of the good, nonetheless, one accepts that there are still values. Like I say, the world is flooded with values, and you yourself have particular preferences, values, which pertain to you, not only your individual self, but also, your friends, family, your group, whatever it may be. It depends on levels of identity flood the body, of course. So it's not just pure egoism. But you'll understand, and also, you can identify with the whole of humanity and say, we need to save ourselves, this way or the other. That would be still, subjective valuation. Or you could identify with the whole of nature. But ultimately, there's always perspectival. It's Nietzsche's perspectivism. It's always ultimately based on the interests that an organism has. It's not based on some transcendental standard to which we can judge things. So it doesn't leave one completely. Like I say, I find it quite positive psychologically, and it's just the only negative thing it does is, I suppose when people talk about certain moral issues in society or whatever, ultimately you're thinking, well, there's no real answer to this, and you go into the psychology more, the underlying unwitting motives, and this can, in everyday life, this can cause issues such as, you don't want to get involved with something because what it's really based on. So that is, I don't really see that as a problem though. It's a bit like not getting involved with children when they have a little squabble about something. It's not. There's no point taking a side of one child against the other. It's just
So I get the sense that you feel maybe that the new atheist phase has done unrelenting damage to the possibilities of nihilism.
New atheism, as I understand it, with Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and that lot, Sam Harris, Dennett. It was a I understand it was a reaction to the creationism which was trying to which was pushing itself in America. I can understand that as the pendulum swung to the other side. With regard to morals, so Richard Dawkins, for example, who was like the arch heretic, as it were, he's completely dominated by Christian values. I mean,
he admitted that eventually, though, didn't he?
Right, yeah, he did, and his best friend's a bishop, and so on. They had no understanding of Nietzsche or the 20th century meta-ethicists or anything like that, and so you get kind of these, humanism or utilitarianism stemming therefrom, and it didn't really. And now, interestingly, it seems that new atheists sort of are now being seen as right wing. I don't really accept that so much, but anyway, it wasn't a mistake. It was necessary at the time, but now its time is finished.
Okay. One big overarching question then, I guess, is that I would probably put them in the same camp actually as well. Is that the philosophical ideas you're speaking of, which are sort of revolving around Whitehead, panpsychism, but also, I think the psychonautical stuff enters into this as well. However we could frame that philosophy or those philosophical ideas of perhaps radical philosophy of mind, so to speak, why do you, if you agree with this, why do you think that the academy, whatever that is often quite reluctant to even, broach them?
Interestingly, in William James's book, Varieties of Religious Experience, written in 1902, he says, we now come to, intoxicants, which people think are linked to psychosis and are sort of, not to be spoken of and whatever. So it's nothing new. Why was that believed? And then, of course, in America, you have the sort of the prohibition laws, for 10 years against alcohol. And then when you look back, just look at, Methodism. I think one of the answers to your question, I think, is the Christian heritage again. Maybe I'm being too Nietzschean here, but when you look at Methodism, I live in Western Cornwall here, where Methodism took root. It came from Cambridge, from Wesley brothers, but John Wesley preached here in West Penwith in Cornwall, westernmost Cornwall, and it was a religion that was for the working class, because the Church of England, Anglicanism was seen as an alliance with the Tories and the sort of middle upper class. And so Methodism took hold, and its main sort of aims were to get rid of gambling and drinking, right, from fathers, mostly from men. It didn't last long here, Methodism. Most of the Methodist chapels have become houses here, but it moved to America and became, big as evangelism, really. One of the reasons, anyway, they were very much against intoxicants. Puritans as well were, and I think that's one reason why that sort of seeped into Western culture as part of Christian culture. Also, of course, when the conquistadors came to the Americas, they saw the psychedelic drug use there as satanic, so there's an immediate link there. So Christianity's got a lot to answer for with regard to that question, but in more sort of practical terms as well, I think there's a number of reasons. In the late 19th, early 20th century, it was like poets and certain philosophers who were dabbling with psychedelics, people like H.H. Price, William James, then Benjamin Paul Blood, Baudelaire. They were dabbling with psychedelics, trying to get something out of them, philosophically, that is, and artistically. There was a fringe movement, but then, of course, this history of psychedelia is that, in the 1960s, Timothy Leary got his hands on psilocybin LSD and then made it into a big thing. And then the authorities cracked down on it. There's racist elements to that with Nixon and so on, the war on drugs, of course. Blah, blah, long history about it. But anyway, psychedelics then became criminalized. And that's obviously one reason why academics didn't touch it. You wouldn't get funding for it, for example. Is frowned upon. That was seen as criminalized or recreational. In other words, as simply entertainment value, of no intellectual value. I think another reason was a lot of propaganda in the 20th century said that psychedelics would like fry your brain. I remember seeing on YouTube this American advert from the sort of 80s, I think, where there was like, someone scrambling eggs and saying this is what LSD does to your brain. So there's that kind of background fear of damaging your tool of trade as a philosopher, I suppose. And also, just it's a very difficult subject. William James and Humphrey Davy before him said that psychedelic experiences are really ineffable. I mean, you can't get to grip with a lot of it. You can't conceptualize it very easily. There's more to experience than concepts and percepts and memories and intentions and so on. It transcends all of that. So it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, still, it's very difficult to create a phenomenology based on psychedelic experiences. Another strong reason, I think, in philosophy, why philosophers didn't touch psychedelics is that the 20th century really saw a horrible reductionism as relates to consciousness. So, with the logical positivists and logical behaviorists, you see, you get the view that consciousness is not real. There's no such thing as the mind. It's just sort of an illusion based on language. And what, terms like happiness, sadness really mean are just, like behavior, smiling or whatever. And unfortunately, this was very big. And then later on, identity theories and so on. But this reductivism in its various guises became very big in 50s and 60s in other words, concurrently to the sudden growth in interest in psychedelics. And so if you don't believe in consciousness, why would you then look at, extreme forms of consciousness? It was unfortunate timing, really.
So I wonder what people, I think I'm right in thinking like is it B.F. Skinner? Wonder what people such as themselves would consider a psychedelic experience to be. Just an alteration of that determinist chain of that doesn't really make any sense, though.
I think psychedelic experience is really falsified by logical behaviorism in many ways because, dreams do as well. So not really particular to psychedelics, but I remember lying down in psilocybin and sort of traveling through galaxies, meeting aliens and whatever, but I was lying. I couldn't move. I was not behaving except for lying down. And, to identify that kind of experience with behavior is just completely and utterly absurd. Absolutely. You can say the same with dreams, but I think psychedelics are much more intense. It can be much more intense than dreams. So it just emphasizes the point. No one really believes in logical behaviorism anymore because it just led to all these logical paradoxes anyway. However, still has a pernicious effect. I've realized recently, when I was speaking on this panel at the Have a Ligetson Festival about a few months ago. I spoke to Rupert Sheldrake about psychedelics, actually. That's coming out soon, hopefully in video. But before that, I was speaking about, is the brain a computer? I think the question was. And I realized there was this professor of artificial intelligence and ethics, the ethics of AI, rather, from Canada or something. And what I didn't realize is logical behaviorism has seeped into the axioms of that whole science. I was quite shocked because in philosophy, it's like, no one believes that, right? Not to say therefore it's wrong, but there's just too many problems with it. But in AI, it's perfect. It's like, there's no real thing as consciousness. So, what we're doing is basically recreating consciousness as, an AI. There's no, they don't see the problems inherent there. So I thought logical behaviorism had died, but actually through Daniel Dennett, people like that, it's kind of seeped its way through modern forms of technology. So it's still, it's still causing problems.
Okay. Do you see much of a future for sort of philosophical investigation into psychedelics, or do you think that we've got a few more years of,
It's slowly. It is. I've been looking at it for over 10 years now, and I've slowly got people on board, I suppose, and now at Exeter University we've got a psychedelic research center. I'm about to teach an undergraduate module on philosophy of psychedelics. Just finished the master's module on it. We've got this really exciting colloquium with the psychology department. Professor Celia Morgan, who's a world expert in ketamine. We do this colloquium every week where we have guest speakers and so on. And then, we had a conference on it. We've got this Bloomsbury book coming out in June, Philosophy and Psychedelics. And then around the world, it is growing. I think it's 10 years ago, people said to me, there's a career killer, don't do this. It's not, but actually it's quite the contrary happened. I think one of the reasons is, like I said, we're just, with the question of consciousness, philosophy of mind, the explanatory gap, the sort of relation between mind and matter. we had all these theories like in the 20th century, 19th century, and they've all come to an impasse. They never worked out. Like, people still don't, there's just no, a lot of people say, I know there's no problem, or I know exactly the relation, but there's no general agreement. And so there's now, for example, there's new theories coming, like extended mind theory, which is very interesting, that, your mind is not reducible to your brain, which is known as neuroessentialism, which is linked to panpsychism, of course, and pantheism to a certain extent. Anyway, there are all these new theories about the mind coming out. And so there's a kind of, there's a looking out now, I think, to new theories of mind, and a looking back. So, people are exploring William James's ideas again in relation to psychedelics, and not just William James, like I said, Humphrey Davy, really, who took nitrous oxide in 1799, 200 pints thereof. I mean, he started off the philosophical investigations in the West with it, really. So I think, and I know there's a lot of interest in philosophy of psychedelics. I mean, I think it's just beginning, really, and it's related. Yeah, it's related to questions in philosophy of mind. As you indicated before, philosophy of mind is kind of like, although I call myself a philosopher of mind, it's kind of generally means a sort of certain field of analytic philosophers. At the same time, psychology is generally more about therapy and politicized, and there's cognitive science, which is more neuroscientific, pharmacological. So I guess there should be another term maybe for what we are doing. I don't know, but I think that this explanatory gap is just like really annoying a lot of people. They're just trying to get an answer. So in other words, expanding your mind perhaps is one avenue to look at the least through psychedelics. I think that generally speaking, there's going to be a return to the 17th century metaphysics, because, I mean, I remember Gödel. I mean, this is maybe just my personal preferences, but Kurt Gödel, the logician and best friend of Einstein, he always said, there's no knowledge has come out of the last 3 centuries, just information, but we've sort of, it was in the 17th century really where these deep metaphysical systems were laid out, Leibniz's, Spinoza's, Descartes, and so on. And then we've just assumed certain ones and gone with that, but we've now hit these impasses of understanding relations of mind to nature, and I think therefore there'll be a turning back to these grand metaphysical schemes again, But that's just, it's just speculation. I don't know what will happen. Maybe we'll all become Muslims, so it's possible. So,
maybe. Yeah, just getting near the end here. Do you want to spend a little time talking about your new book?
Can do, yeah. So I got a new book with psychedelic. I got 2 new books. One is the Bloomsbury book, Philosophy and Psychedelics, which is 15 chapters by different people. One is by me, edited by me and Professor Christine Hauskeller at the University of Exeter. That's coming out in June. It's about all varied aspects of philosophy and psychedelics, from aesthetics, Marxism, Walter Benjamin, whatever. But my own personal book of essays, Modes of Sentience, came out a few weeks ago, and it's 10 essays, like Noumenautics, on I've got it here somewhere. On it's the first chapter is on panpsychism, as an outline and a defense of it, as clearly as I could put it. Then there's a few chapters on Whitehead's version of panpsychism, panexperientialism, including a biographical account. Then there's a chapter on the epistemology of psychedelics, another one on the influence that psychedelics have had on philosophers through the ages, and then one on Humphrey Davy, actually, the first scientific psychonaut. He's a Penzance man. His statue's a few miles away from here, and his friend, his associations with Coleridge and Wordsworth and the idealists, and his poem The Spinozas. And the last chapter is really out there. It's called Deeper Than Depth: N-Dimensional Space and Sentience. So that's on the question of the relationship, really, the older one question about the relationship between space and mind, but it goes into n-dimension, 3 types of space and various dimensions of space to understand the relationship. Very quickly, why do I do that? So one of the reasons, identity theory, monism generally, like Spinoza's, right? Or psychoneural identity theory, as you get into 20th century, that said that mind and matter are the same thing seen from different perspectives, right? But what do you mean by different perspectives? How can that be so? Because the properties of both seem to be very different. For example, emotions. No, I take the example of a blue triangle, right? If you imagine a blue triangle, it's got certain spatial properties. William James said, contrary to Baker, actually mind is not non-extensive. Actually, it can have extensive properties. In the spatial qual, this great essay he's written. But anyway, if you imagine like a blue triangle that has certain spatial properties, the correlate of that in your brain, presumably the occipital lobe, has spatial properties, the neurons, there's sort of activity there, which are very distinct from that which is imagined. So how can the same thing have different spatial properties, right? So that's one way to look at the explanatory gap or the hard problem of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. This sort of relationship between spatial properties between two of the different sides of the correlation. And then you get into like a minefield of what space is, how does it relate to non-Euclidean geometry, dimensionality, and so on. So I go down that line. It's really out there. I mean, it's very speculative, but
I mean, perhaps this is a peculiar question, but considering you have such a an emphasis and passion on panpsychism consistently, could any experience sort of uproot your acceptance of it?
I mean, panpsychism is a metaphysical, not a scientific theory, so it's not subject to the falsification principle from Karl Popper. For a start, right? I say that. It's always inference best explanation. Could something, I mean, if it could be shown, although I think it's theoretically impossible, that the mind can emerge from matter. If a transordinal nomology, as it's known, bridge laws, are shown, then I would accept that panpsychism need not be the case. But theoretically, proving scientific laws that bridge structural matter with mentality would be something that would have to change science itself. It would be another form of laws of nature. So without that, I think it's much more parsimonious to hold a panpsychological point of view. But of course, I'm not dogmatic about it. I just see it as the best alternative at the moment. Perhaps something will change my mind, but I'm not aware of what that would be at this present moment.
Okay.
But you never know yourself properly, do you? But I think I come to panpsychism through a purely rational perspective. But I mean, when you look at these things in depth, you realize all the problems there are of it as well. Like, for example, I said, beyond the combination problem, so-called, there's another problem of defining the units of subjectivity. I think this is a key problem. So it's not a perfect theory. It doesn't all make sense. Spinozism, like I say, it's easy to say that mind and matter, different perspectives, are the same thing. But how could they be if they have different properties? This is another issue. So there are still many, many questions unresolved. You can go to the line of Colin McGinn Mysterianism and say, like, human mind is not capable of understanding this relation. It's a possibility as well. I don't. Yeah.
Okay.
So ultimately, I don't know.
Unless the laws of the universe are basically overhauled, then no. Okay.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I suppose so.
Are you currently? I mean, obviously, you've just finished up and published this book, but are you currently working on anything new?
Yeah, I'm looking at Ernst Haeckel at the moment because I'm writing an essay on his panpsychism. Ernst Haeckel, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was big in the 19th century. He was a biologist. I mean, he's known to be a great artist. You can get, if you buy a book on him, he's got these amazing pictures of unicellular organisms and other organisms. An amazing artist, but he was at the time more famous for bringing Darwinism to Germany. And he wanted to create a monistic religion, basically a scientific religion based on Spinoza. So I'm looking at that in a moment. He's also a eugenicist, and he had some errors in his evolutionary theory, but interesting character. I'm working on that. I'm looking at deep ecology in relation to Spinoza's and Whitehead more and more. I'm also interestingly looking at Amerindian notions of animism in relation to psychedelic use in relation to panpsychism, Western panpsychism. And then we've got possibly a project with the psychology department on psilocybin coming up, which will maybe is really unknown, but might fuse metaphysics with the latest scientific research on psychedelics. So maybe, a lot of maybes. I'm teaching philosophy of psychedelics undergraduate module this term, but starting next week, and some talks, talking Bristol, talking Dublin, maybe London. What else? I don't know. Look, yeah, there's a lot of things going on, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds pretty packed.
Yeah.
But yeah, that seems. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add. I mean, we can find this book on Amazon, but also this is published by psychedelicpress.co.uk. I assume we can find it there as well. And your latest book is on via the same people?
No, the latest book's Bloomsbury.
Bloomsbury.
Okay. So just Google it, Philosophy and Psychedelics.
Oh no, I meant the other one.
Oh, Modes of Sentience. Oh, sorry, no, yeah, no. Well, okay, 3 books, and yeah, so Noumenautics Psychedelic Press. You can get it on Amazon and Psychedelic Press website. The same with Modes of Sentience. The hardback limited edition has run out, I'm afraid, but the paperback's available on Amazon. And then the third one, Philosophy and Psychedelics with Bloomsbury, that will be out in June, and you can find that on their website, I guess.
Okay. Well, Peter, I think that's a good place to finish up. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James.